The Jets finally get to work in free agency, adding their veteran backup quarterback behind Aaron Rodgers and a couple of players to help in the trenches. Let's break it down today. It's Locked On Jets.
You are Locked On Jets, your daily New York Jets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome. This is the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. It is Tuesday, March 12th, 2024, and I'm your host, John B. from GanggreenNation.com. Thanking you so much for making the show your first listen or first watch every day. Subscribe to the show for free on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts so you get new episodes as soon as they're posted. If you enjoy the show and are listening on a podcast source, please give it a 5-star review. And if you're watching on YouTube and enjoy the show, give this episode a big thumbs up. It helps us out, helps other Jets fans find the podcast. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more. Right now, new customers get $200 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $200 if your bet wins. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to get started. Well, today we're going to break down 3 signings the Jets made overnight. And no, you're not seeing double. I recorded a show for Tuesday, and I posted it based on the Jets losing Bryce Huff and the Jets otherwise being pretty quiet the first day of free agency. And wouldn't you know it, as soon as I post that show, the Jets get active. Yeah, thanks, Jets. Great timing. So this is actually our second episode on Tuesday because overnight the Jets made 3 signings. They finally got to work in free agency, and we're going to break those signings down. You know, the first signing, I don't know if it's the most significant one because the Jets did sign a player who is probably going to be a starter on their offensive line. That's John Simpson. We'll get to that in a bit, but I think the signing that might get the most attention is the Jets did address the backup quarterback spot. And I think part of the reason that's going to draw so much attention is based on what happened last year with this team. And if you, I don't know, if for whatever reason you did not follow the Jets in 2024, I mean, maybe this is not the right podcast for you, but the Jets lost Aaron Rodgers, their starting quarterback, 4 plays into the season. So the Jets essentially had to play their full season with their backup quarterback. Then they had their third string quarterback start some games. And then by the end of the year, it was a guy they had signed during the season, Trevor Siemian, to step into the starting lineup. So Jets really had to deal with backup quarterbacks a year ago, and things did not go very well because last offseason, the Jets did not do a good job addressing that spot. And I think the Jets finally realized that backup quarterback is one of the most important players on your roster. And the Jets ended up bringing a guy who's a kind of a familiar name. You know, if you follow the Jets for at least a decade, you probably recognize the name Tyrod Taylor because you saw him in the AFC East. He was the Buffalo Bills starting quarterback for 3 years from 2015 through 2018. Guy who's been a pretty solid quarterback through much of his career. In fact, this is the kind of guy I felt like the Jets should have gone out and gotten a year ago. Now, the reports are something in the range of 2 years, could be up to $18 million, which doesn't really tell us anything because the phrase up to includes possible incentives. So we have to wait on like the real dollar figures. But I think this is a really solid move. I think this is exactly the kind of guy the Jets should have been looking to go out and get. Tyrod Taylor's a guy who, knows what he's doing. He knows how to run an offense. And Tyrod Taylor is actually what I'd call like the perfect quarterback for analysts who want to make cliches because, he's a veteran. He knows what he's doing back there. He knows how to run an offense. He knows how to keep an offense on schedule. It's like every cliche you hear from like veteran studio analysts probably applies to Tyrod Taylor. And that's usually these moves like aren't as good as like they make it out to be, but I think this is a pretty solid move. I think Tyrod's probably like a mid-tier backup, a guy who has never been a huge big play guy through his career, at least through the air, but understands where the ball needs to go, does a good job getting it there, doesn't have the biggest arm in the league, doesn't have the greatest pocket presence. In fact, takes a lot of bad sacks. These are reasons he's in part that he's a backup quarterback. He's not a starting quarterback. I think, he's in his 30s now. The mobility is also not what it used to be. Tyrod Taylor used to be a guy who could produce plays on the ground. And I'm not saying like he's a statue back there. I think he's going to have more mobility than Aaron Rodgers, but it's been like 5 years since he had a 50-yard rushing game. I think that he's a guy who now in his older age needs to pick his spots a little bit more. It's also a guy who's bounced around the NFL. He started with the Baltimore Ravens way back when he first entered the NFL, went to Buffalo, had stints with other teams. He was with Cleveland for a bit. He was with the Chargers. He also spent a year, the last 2 seasons with the Giants. And, part of what's good about having a veteran backup is they're going to pick up whatever system you run pretty easily. Sometimes when you bring in a guy who's younger, they may have a more difficult time learning your offense. But a guy who's been around the league like Tyrod, first of all, he understands how to study a system. But second of all, he's pretty much been in every system imaginable. So I'm sure he's been in an offense that's similar to what Nathaniel Hackett does. Well, I hope for his sake he hasn't been in an offense similar to what Nathaniel Hackett does. But stylistically, the certain things that will probably line up in the playbook with things he's done in the past. So, I think the Jets made a big deal that we're going to go get a veteran backup for Aaron Rodgers this year. And here's the other point I'm going to make is that people always say, well, if Aaron Rodgers gets hurt the first game of the season, the Jets are in big trouble. And that's true. Few teams are built to withstand losing your starting quarterback 4 plays into the season. But that's not always the reason you go out and get a backup quarterback. You get a backup quarterback more for the medium range, the short term, the medium term. If your quarterback has to miss a game here or there, if your quarterback has to miss, I don't know, maybe a month. That's where the difference between having a backup quarterback and not having a backup quarterback really comes into play, because you may need to win a game or two, and that game or two might either help your seeding, it might help you get a home game, it might help you win the division title. It might be the difference between making or missing the playoffs. And that's really where it makes a difference. I can never get over people who say, well, the backup quarterback's irrelevant. Who cares if the backup, who cares who cares who the backup is if your starter goes down? You're in big trouble anyway. Well, have we not seen teams win Super Bowls with the backup quarterback? Did the Eagles not win the Super Bowl 7 years ago with Nick Foles? And if Foles had to play the entire season, I don't know that the Eagles necessarily would have won the Super Bowl. But Carson Wentz got hurt in December of that year. Foles won a couple games. He was able to throw together a couple big games in the playoffs. Could Foles have played like that the full 16 game at the time schedule? Probably not. But he got hot at the right time. He was a good backup quarterback. That, I think, is the mindset you should be looking for at the backup quarterback spot. And the Jets, I think, for years have neglected this. And I think this is one of my criticisms of Joe Douglas, is that I feel like Joe Douglas is a very reactive GM, is that he never really addresses anything before it becomes a crisis. And last year, backup quarterback became a crisis for the Jets because they had to deal with Zach Wilson all season long. Through Douglas's tenure, you look at the quarterbacks who've been the backups here. You've got, Zach Wilson last year, got late career Joe Flacco. And I know Joe Flacco had a great year last year with Cleveland, but Joe Flacco was not great with the Jets. The Jets could not replicate what the Browns did. Mike White, who's, I love Mike White, had a couple great games. The great game against Cincinnati in 21, the great game against the Bears in 22. But Mike White's, kind of probably a low-level backup. Finally, the Jets, I think, go out and get a guy who's going to add stability to the backup quarterback spot. So, it took what happened last year for Joe Douglas to do it, but at least the Jets went out and got a quality backup quarterback. They also went out and got a new starting left guard. As we continue on this Tuesday edition of Locked On Jets, we're going to talk about the newest member of the Jets offensive line, John Simpson. Is he a good fit? And I have my doubts, I got to be honest with you. I'll explain why as we continue on this Tuesday edition of Locked On Jets. This episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by FanDuel. Say goodbye to busted brackets, because FanDuel lets you bet on every game of the tourney. Whether you're betting on a big upset or a one seed, it's time to go dancing on America's #1 sportsbook. And right now, new customers can get $200 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. That's $200 to use on point spreads, money lines. You can even pick who's going to win it all. That's music to my ears, because I can't count the number of years where I filled out a bracket, felt really good about it heading into the tournament, and then the first round, one of my final 4 teams goes down, and the second round, everybody loses. Well, now you have a second chance on FanDuel. You can still bet on who's going to go deep into the tournament. Best of all worlds. Just visit FanDuel.com/lockedon. Again, it's FanDuel.com/lockedon, LOCKEDON, and bet on college hoops until they cut down the nets. Thank you so much for making Locked On Jets your first listen or first watch every day. And a big shout out to you, everydayers. This is a daily podcast covering the New York Jets. We have new episodes each day through the week, Monday through Friday, and then bonus episodes as news breaks, such as this one. This is actually our second episode on Tuesday because I recorded our Tuesday episode. And then right after I posted it, the Jets got to work signing 3 players. Now, we've talked about the move that I think is going to generate the most attention, which is the Jets signing Tyrod Taylor. Now let's talk about the move of the 3 that's probably the most significant. And it's because he's probably going to start on the Jets offensive line. The Jets signed John Simpson, a guard. He spent last season with the Baltimore Ravens. He was originally a 4th-round pick of the Raiders back in 2020, spent a couple of seasons there. Simpson was the Ravens starting left guard in 2023. The Jets get him on a 2-year contract worth about $18 million. So you could say that the Jets essentially used the Laken Tomlinson savings to get Simpson. Simpson's played left guard his whole career, so I think we could probably slot him in at the left guard position. Now, I'm going to say something. It's going to sound like I'm making a loaded comment, but I'm really not. This is just more of an observation. This is the kind of signing that I expect Joe Douglas to make on the offensive line. Now, and I'm not saying that as a criticism. I'm just saying this is the kind of move. It's like an upside move. Simpson's a guy who is very toolsy. He's 26 years old, so you hope that he's still ascending. Pretty big guy, 6'4", the 330, 340 range. If you look at his athletic testing, at the combine, pretty good. Guy who's been inconsistent through much of his career. I mean, I know a lot of people have pointed to his stat last year that he only allowed 1 sack, but you have to remember, his quarterback's Lamar Jackson, who evades pressure pretty well. If you look at his actual pass blocking numbers, he wasn't terrible. It wasn't awful, but it wasn't great either. As a run blocker, guy pretty inconsistent. I mean, I think Simpson's really an inconsistent guy across the board. A guy who is probably in the Laken Tomlinson range and has been through much of his career. A guy who's probably a low end starter at the guard position. Now, I think that the hope is that the Jets can improve him. I think the hope is that we'll see what the Jets are able to do at the tackle position. But I think with Joe Tippmann at center, the Jets have big expectations for him. If they go out and get a really quality left tackle, maybe that's the kind of thing that can stabilize Simpson, because sometimes the guys next to you playing well can make a big difference for you. Laken Tomlinson playing next to Trent Williams in San Francisco certainly made a big difference for him. So I think the hope is, and I've been talking about this a lot, is that sometimes your offensive line has a situation where the sum is greater than the whole of the whole is greater than the sum of the parts, where maybe your guys aren't great individually, but you just find the right mix of players and they get chemistry and hopefully they stay healthy and there's some degree of continuity. And then everybody starts playing well together. I mean, on its merits, on it alone, is this a great signing? I think you'd have to say no. Simpson is certainly not a guy who's an outstanding tackle. Now, I think you can make the case that maybe he's ascending because prior to last year, he wasn't even last year. I think he was kind of like a low level starter in Baltimore. Prior to that, I don't even think you could really say that. I think, you would say he was a guy who, what really wasn't very good. That's why the Raiders got rid of him after drafting him in the 4th round in 2020. I think a lot of it's going to be determined by what comes after this, because what else are the Jets going to do on the offensive line? We know they needed to add 3 offensive linemen, 2 tackles and 1 guard. It seems like they've settled on the guard that they'd like. And I think, part of this is if the Jets got Simpson for lesser money, I almost wonder whether he was brought in to be a guy who competes for a job, maybe a high level backup. But I think the Jets gave him starter money. So I think the idea that he's going to be anything other than a starter is not accurate. So I look at this. I wish I loved this signing. And part of this is they're kind of taking a swing at a upside project, and it's not the worst idea in the world in theory, but part of it is, do you have the infrastructure to get the most out of a project? And the Jets, and I think it is worth mentioning, the Jets have the worst offensive line coach in the NFL, if not one of the worst offensive line coaches in the NFL, and somebody like Keith Carter. Carter is a guy who, it's not just that the results are bad, is that the guy gets criticized over and over and over by players who played for him. A lot of guys just have come out afterwards. If you look at what's come out of Tennessee after he left there, he was a former Titans offensive line coach before he came to the Jets. Guys just talk about how he didn't teach them anything, how he didn't understand how to get them to work in practice. So, I mean, any enthusiasm I have for a signing like this is really tempered with the idea that Keith Carter is the offensive line coach, because I feel like if the Jets had a better coach up front, if the Jets had a coach who was adept at training guys on the offensive line, somebody like Bill Callahan. Bill Callahan was the Jets offensive line coach back during the early Rex Ryan years. Like he was a great coach. He was a guy who knew how to develop players. He got a great track record of developing offensive linemen. If the Jets had like somebody like him, I would be really excited about the Simpson signing, because Simpson's a guy with a lot of upside. And he flashes. I mean, you can probably see like online, if you go to like X, there are going to be people who will post short videos of Simpson like having a dominant rep in run blocking or a great rep in pass blocking today. There's potential there. Guy has the ability to be very good. And I think like part of the rationale behind this signing, and again, is a typical Joe Douglas signing. Is Simpson worth $9 million a year today based on what he's done? No. The hope is that he becomes a bargain. Hope is that he improves to a point where that $9 million is viewed as a great value deal for the Jets. Now, Douglas has tried this a lot, and it hasn't always worked out. He's tried it a couple times at the receiver position. Mecole Hardman last year was an example. He tried it with Brashad Perryman. You go back to 2021. He tried it with Jared Davis. He's essentially betting on upside. He's betting on guys who have physical tools and their ability to put it together. Does it always work? Well, again, listen to the names of the guys I just mentioned. But the hope is that he's able to make good on his promise. And if he does, then this could be a really good signing for the Jets. And if he doesn't, we'll be sitting here in November and people will be saying, how did the Jets sign this guy? So this is the type of signing. It's difficult to give a firm grade right now. Based on what I know, I'll be honest with you, I don't love it, but I think you have to let this play out. I think you have to give it a chance. Now, head here on the Locked On Jets podcast, we're going to turn our attention to another project the Jets signed in the trenches, but this one is on the defensive side of the ball. Former first-round pick, guy with some familiarity with Robert Saleh. Tell you who it is and why I think it could be a solid move as we continue on this Tuesday edition of Locked On Jets. This show is sponsored by BetterHelp. What's the first thing you'd do if you had an extra hour in your day? Now, of course, on Sunday, we actually had one less hour because it was spring ahead. But, we should always try and maximize our time. And a lot of us spend our lives wishing we had more time. The question is, time for what? If time was unlimited, how would you use it? The best way to squeeze that special thing into your schedule is to know what's important to you and to make it a priority. And therapy can help find what matters to you so you can do more of it. Therapy has so many benefits. It's helpful for learning positive coping skills, how to set boundaries. It empowers you to be the best version of yourself. And it's not just for those who have experienced major trauma. If you're thinking of starting therapy, give BetterHelp a try. It's entirely online, designed to be flexible, convenient, and suited to your schedule. Just fill out a brief questionnaire to get matched with a licensed therapist and switch therapists at any time for no additional charge. Learn to make time for what makes you happy with BetterHelp. Visit BetterHelp.com/lockedon to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/lockedon. This is the Locked On Jets podcast here on this Tuesday. It's our second episode of the day. We're breaking down signings that the Jets made overnight. Now, the Jets made a signing on their defensive line. It's kind of a low-key, under-the-radar signing. It's a former first-round pick of the San Francisco 49ers, Javon Kinlaw. He was a first-round pick of San Francisco, 14th overall in the 2020 NFL Draft. That's significant because Robert Saleh was the 49ers defensive coordinator at the point they drafted Kinlaw in the first round. So Saleh has some familiarity with him. Kinlaw worked with Saleh during his rookie year, and then after that season, Saleh got the head coaching job with the New York Jets. Kinlaw was a pretty big disappointment for San Francisco in the first round. He never really lived up to that billing. Missed a number of games through his career. In fact, in 2021 and 2022, only played 10 games combined. But I have to tell you, I actually kind of like this signing. Now, part of it's that Kinlaw is not being brought in to be a starter for the Jets. I think he's being brought in to be like a part-time player for this team. And while Kinlaw, I don't think lived up to the billing of a first-round pick. In fact, I don't think he came anywhere close to living up to the billing. You could make a case, pretty strong case, that he was a bust for San Francisco. I think part of it's just that, like, he didn't live up. It's one thing to say you didn't live up to the first round hype. It's another thing to say you're a player who brings nothing to the table. I think Kinlaw brings things to the table. I think a part-time role will suit him. And I think he's the type of guy where if he was drafted in like the fourth or fifth round, San Francisco would have been pretty happy with what they got. I think he's being brought in to be like a situational guy. You'll see him on passing down. So he may take the Quentin Jefferson role. I'm hoping he takes over for Solomon Thomas. I mean, I'm going to be aspirational here and say maybe the Jets bring Quentin Jefferson back and Solomon Thomas is the odd man out. But even in the Quentin Jefferson role, I think that this is a pretty solid move. And I know like a lot of Jets fans liked Jefferson. And look, I'll be honest, Jefferson had a pretty solid season last year, but he's in his 30s. And the other thing I keep saying is that, you put anybody with talent next to Quinnen Williams, they're probably going to produce. And in the case of Kinlaw, I think you got a guy who's clearly younger, and a guy who, if you put him in a part-time role next to Quinnen Williams rushing the passer, I bet you he can get you 5 sacks or so. Now, he's not a guy who's been particularly strong against the run in his career. That's been part of his problem. The other problems, he's just had trouble staying on the field. Again, 10 games combined in 21 and 22. But we're talking about a part-time role. We're going to limit his snaps. We're going to keep him focused on the things he does well. He does get to the quarterback pretty effectively. The last year had over 30 pressures, which is a good thing in a role that was a part-time role. Only about 320 pass snaps. Over 30 pressures. So guy who gets to the quarterback pretty well. A guy who's going to add to the pass rush. The Jets love adding these guys who are part-time players. They love rotating guys in and out. They like to keep everybody fresh up front on the pass rush. And, everything I just said about John Simpson, how, I don't trust the Jets coaching staff to develop John Simpson. The opposite is true for Kinlaw. This is a guy with first-round talent, and it's very easy to say, I see this used to justify a lot of bad signings. Oh, the guy went in the first round. He must have talent. Lots of guys get drafted in the first round and they disappoint. And they go to some new team and everybody hypes them up, but the coaching staff really doesn't know how to make use of them. I think that's different with the Jets. I think the Jets coaching staff, outside of the Bryce Huff situation, deserves the benefit of the doubt when it comes to defensive linemen. They've made a lot of good judgments, and they've also developed guys. They've gotten the best out of a lot of players. And Kinlaw is not a guy who I expect to ever live up to that first-round billing. I don't think he and Quinnen Williams are going to be the next great duo. I think Kinlaw is going to be a part-time player. I think he's going to play a limited number of snaps. I think he's going to go out there and do his job very effectively. I like this as an under-the-radar signing for the Jets. The original terms of the deal were not available immediately, but I can't imagine they paid him that much. I mean, this is a guy, again, who's first-round pick, very moderate production through most of his career. 49ers let him go. In fact, 49ers did not pick up his fifth-year option, which always a sign that a guy who just has not lived up to his draft status. But the Jets don't need him to live up to his draft status. And this is the key. Is like part of it's the expectations game. If the Jets were bringing him in and saying, like, this is our new starter next to Quinnen Williams, he's going to play full-time, we're expecting him to live up to that first-round billing, I'd have an issue with this signing. I think is like a low money, kind of a buy low bet. I like the move. I think it's a move that could really pay off for the New York Jets. Not everybody needs to be a superstar. Jets have a superstar defensive tackle. That's Quinnen Williams. What they're looking for are guys that can fill in around Quinnen, guys who can play situational roles. And to me, that's something Kinlaw can do. So, this is not going to be the biggest move the Jets make all offseason. It's not going to be the move that has the most impact. It's not going to be the move that generates the most attention, nor should it be, quite frankly. It's just one of those under-the-radar depth moves. And frequently, you sign anybody who's a backup, you'll say, oh, depth is taken care of. I think this one could actually work out pretty well. I can never guarantee a move like this is going to pan out, but looking at the fundamentals, looking at certain aspects of this move, looking at the thought process behind it, looking at the Jets coaching staff familiarity with him, look at the role that they're putting him in. This is a move to me that could actually add up in a way that kind of transcends how under the radar it is and how disappointing Kinlaw has been. I think that this is the type of thing that could actually work out pretty well for the Jets. But anyway, that's all for this episode. This has been the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day is our motto. As always, if you enjoy the show, hit the subscribe button where you're watching or listening so that you'll never miss an episode. If you enjoy the show and are listening on a podcast source, give it a 5-star review. And if you're watching on YouTube and enjoy the show, give this episode a big thumbs up. It helps us out, helps other Jets fans find the podcast. Enjoy the rest of your Tuesday, everybody. We'll be back next time to talk more Jets.